Dr. David Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make my first contribution focused on Part 2, on Clause 41, the transitional provisions, which are actually surprisingly interesting. And I challenge members opposite to have a look through these transitional provisions, because there's some cracker stuff in here. There's some stuff that tells us a bit about what the government is on about here, and it's buried in the related schedules, which are referred to precisely in this part of the Act. In subclause 1, it refers to Schedule 2, the transitional provisions relating to the transfer of the functions, work and employees of the Standards Council. And one of the things that's immediately obvious in there is that the assets, records, liabilities and debts of the existing Standards Council will transfer and become vested in the Ministry. And with that comes both opportunity and risk, of course, because I'm not familiar with the detail that is recorded in those records, and I do not know whether they will capture all of the intellectual property that goes with the existing members of that council, or a portion thereof, and exactly what grace there will be in the handover of that, given the fact that the members on that council will be feeling a little like they haven't been listened to, and also like their contribution hasn't been valued for what it was and is currently. The opportunity lies in there, though, for the government to learn something from it. The concerns I've expressed already around international connectedness, the representation in international fora, having New Zealand represented at the table when standards are set to ensure that New Zealand industry interests are protected, and New Zealand interests more generally, and that the relationships that are built around that. I want to skip over from there to the fourth part of Schedule 2, where it talks about the determining of whether each subcommittee's work will continue or not, because this is a crunch issue, and it will be in these decisions that we see where the government's agenda lies, which things it wants to flick on, which things it wants to continue with, and where its funding priorities lie. And I suspect strongly that we will see that it will focus on those industries that are already wealthy, that can afford to fund the development of standards readily, and focus less on those industries that are nascent, that are full of entrepreneurs, full of people who wish to make a mark on the world stage, the young and growing enterprises that we would want to encourage to ensure an increasing diversity in our economy. Because the diversification issue is one that comes up again and again around this House. We know that we are too reliant for our wealth on the primary sector. We know that we are incredibly grateful for the efforts of the primary sector, but this government is content to blame them when it goes wrong and seems to have no strategy for diversifying the economy. And here we will see, in this particular handover, in these transitional arrangements, just where its priorities lie. We will see whether the government chooses to continue on with the work that would diversify our economy, or whether it focuses instead on those industries that are already entrenched. So this is where the rubber hits the road. It's an incredibly important part of the bill, Part 2. And but in this part of my contribution, I'm just focusing on that clause, because there are other clauses I wish to speak to. The next thing that leaps out at members here, and will outrage some, of course, is Clause 5, in Schedule 2, Subclause 3. And I'll read it out to members who won't have read it before, I'm sure. This clause overrides Part 6A of the Employment Relations Act 2000. A very short clause, and what it tells you, this clause overrides Part 6A of the Employment Relations Act 2000. This is the protection clause for vulnerable workers that is in the legislation. The government has here, in a sub-schedule at the back of this very thick bill, shoved in a clause that overrides the protections for vulnerable workers. Right here we are. Why? Why in this bill, of all places? It just goes to show the real agenda of the government is tucked away here. Well, I'd be very interested to hear from the Minister just why this clause is so important. How many people work at the Standards Council who are vulnerable workers? Probably 1 or 2 cleaners, maybe. Some part-time workers, I'm not sure, but the Minister has it in for them because he's put a clause in specifically to ensure that they are not protected in this transition. And it goes on the next page. It says, in terms of employment of transferred employees to be treated as, Mr Chair,
Dr David Clark,
to be treated as continuous employment. The employment of a transferred employee by the Ministry is to be treated as continuous employment for the purposes of any enactment. So if they're transferring people, they don't want to be giving any special privileges. They don't want to be making any redundancy payments first or carrying over or anything. It's all in the interest of the Ministry and in the interests of this particular Minister, I would suggest. It is an outrage that can be put in there in the schedules at the back, hidden away, to be discovered only when the fine print is read on this bill. These transitional arrangements tell us a lot about the government. They will be where rubber hits the road, as I've said in this bill. So there's also clauses in here about the government's superannuation fund and what people are entitled to, but and specifying what they're not entitled to quite precisely, because it doesn't want people to be better off for this shift. This is a government that is that mean that in the sub-clauses of the bill it overrides the vulnerable worker protection that we have ensconced in our legislation in this Parliament. And I consider that to be an outrage and to show just how out of touch this government has become. If it thinks it can get away with hiding these things away in the fine print and not be noticed in the debate. And this is certainly something that wasn't brought up in the Select Committee. I think there would have been something in our minority report had we spotted that particular schedule at the time. I don't think we spent much time on the schedules at the back of the bill, but it's something that's leapt out at me right now in this debate. And I'd be interested to hear if the Minister would consider at the last minute making an amendment to that, because it is certainly within his powers to do that. But as I said at the outset, the test, one of the other tests will be where we see what the Ministry transfers, what work it carries on with, what work it does not carry on with, Mr Chair. These are the things that will matter for the industries that are seeking the support of standards that are in their interest as they develop products and want to put them out on the international market. Can the New Zealand products and the New Zealand manufacturers be guaranteed that the international standards will be easy for them to reach in terms of the manufacturing techniques and varieties available here? Or will they be standards that play to the interests of whoever's in the room with an excluded New Zealand component, because it's just not a priority for this government? The funding, as I said in the outset, has not been a priority. It will come down in this where rubber hits road section. We'll see that it's also not a priority, and that's signalled clearly by the fact that the vulnerable worker clause overrides existing legislation here in the schedule at the back. And of course, as Mr Farfoy has already noted, the overriding of the concerns of industry members in the committee, I suspect that those same concerns will be thrust aside in the transitional arrangements as they try to give their handover and say, this is the valuable work of the Standards Committee, these are the international fora that are most important that we attend, this is where we've got the most traction, where we have the relationships, where we can ensure New Zealand's interests are protected. On the track record of what we've seen so far, this government has blinkers on. The Minister is dead set on doing things a certain way, of drawing more into his mega multi-enterprise, the MB monolith with the big sign outside. It's a power grab, and there can be no mistake about that. This is an attempt to bring more under his control, to direct officials, to skew it towards the interests he is interested in. And as we see these transitional arrangements, I'm sure we will see more of the same, Mr Chair. So my submission to this House is that it would be very good if the Minister would explain why the vulnerable people need the clause in the legislation that protects vulnerable workers needs to be overridden in this schedule. Who in particular is he trying to target here, and why? And also, why are they being so specific around any payments that are carried over and any arrangements around employment? It feels a little bit like the government is being mean-spirited in targeting a small group of individuals who made a genuine and lasting contribution to New Zealand's economic development. And there's a deep irony in that coming from a government that is driving down exports as a percentage of our GDP, that is unfortunately making life hard for small businesses, with fewer small businesses being created under this government than the previous government. And that is the irony, I guess, in here, where we have a government so obsessed with controlling the transitional provisions to ensure that no one is looked after in the transition. Thank you, Mr Chair.
I call Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. And I